The wind howled like a wounded animal through the desolate Colorado peaks, driving a wall of blinding white snow that swallowed the highway whole. 9 men, hardened by the road and bound by the infamous Death's Head patch of the Hells Angels, were losing a terrifying battle against nature. Hypothermia was setting in. Death was minutes away. Then a single, flickering amber light pierced the suffocating darkness. It belonged to Beatrice Washington, a 72-year-old widow living entirely alone in the unforgiving wilderness. What happened when she opened her door to 9 towering outlaws wouldn't just save their lives, it would shatter her world by morning. The San Juan Mountains of Colorado were notorious for their unforgiving temperament, but the storm that descended on that late November evening was something pulled straight from a nightmare. Meteorologists had warned of a severe front, but the sheer velocity with which the temperature plummeted caught everyone off guard. 72-year-old Beatrice Washington stood by the frosted window of her isolated log cabin, a steaming mug of chicory coffee warming her weathered hands. Beatrice, a retired schoolteacher with a spine of steel and a heart that had weathered its own personal blizzards, had lived on this remote stretch of mountain road for 30 years. Since her husband Robert passed away a decade ago, the silence of the woods had been her only companion. As the wind began to scream, violently shaking the heavy timber frames of her home, Beatrice pulled her thick wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She double-checked the locks, stoked the massive stone fireplace until the embers roared into life, and prepared for a long, lonely night. 5 miles down the treacherous mountain pass, a very different struggle for survival was unfolding. Dan Grizzly Jenkins gripped the handlebars of his Harley-Davidson with fingers that had long since gone completely numb. Grizzly was the president of his Hells Angels chapter, a towering man of 6'4" with a beard like steel wool and eyes that had seen the darkest corners of the world. Behind him, riding in a tight, desperate formation, were 8 of his most loyal brothers: Tommy Wrench Gallagher, Caleb Ghost Henderson, Arthur Bull Maddox, Leon Snake Rossi, Wyatt Doc Ford, Jackson Rip Cole, Samuel Rusty Brooks, and the newest patch, a 21-year-old kid named Cody Mitchell. They had been pushing hard to make it to a safe house across the state line, foolishly believing they could outrun the storm. It was a miscalculation that was about to cost them their lives. The snow didn't just fall, it attacked. It blew horizontally, a blinding white sheet that reduced visibility to absolute zero. The temperature dropped to 20 below, freezing the oil in their engines and turning the asphalt into a deadly sheet of black ice. "Pull over!" Grizzly roared over the deafening wind, though he could barely hear his own voice. He signaled frantically to the pack. One by one, the massive V-twin engines began to sputter and die, choking on the freezing air. Young Cody Mitchell's bike fishtailed violently. He fought the handlebars, but the ice offered no traction. The heavy motorcycle slammed onto its side, pinning Cody's leg against the frozen earth as they slid toward the edge of a sheer drop. "Kid!" Arthur Maddox bellowed, leaping off his own stalling bike and sliding across the ice. He grabbed Cody by the collar of his leather cut, hoisting him up just as the motorcycle teetered dangerously close to the abyss. Cody was shivering violently, his lips tinged with a frightening shade of blue. "I can't feel my hands, Bull," the young biker stammered, his teeth chattering loud enough to be heard over the gale. Grizzly surveyed his men. These were hardened outlaws, men who had survived prison riots, brutal street fights, and the darkest elements of the criminal underworld. But out here, against the raw, unbridled fury of the mountain, their leather vests and tough exteriors meant absolutely nothing. They were just flesh and bone, and the mountain was rapidly turning them to ice. Wyatt Doc Ford, an Army veteran who served as the club's medic, pushed through the snow to Grizzly's side. "Grizz, we got maybe 20 minutes before the cold stops their hearts. Kid is already slipping into stage 2 hypothermia. If we stay out here, we're dead." Grizzly squinted into the white abyss. To their left was a sheer rock wall. To their right, a drop into nothingness. They were trapped. Panic, a deeply unfamiliar emotion for the chapter president, began to claw at his chest. Then, through a momentary break in the swirling vortex of snow, Caleb Henderson spotted it. "There!" Caleb pointed a shaking, leather-clad finger up a steep, winding embankment. Faint, warm and defiant against the storm, a single yellow light blinked through the trees. "Leave the bikes," Grizzly ordered, his voice cracking from the freezing air. "We walk. Grab Cody. Move!" The 9 men abandoned their prized machines, tramping off the highway and into snow that was already thigh-deep. Arthur Maddox and Tommy Gallagher practically carried young Cody between them. Every step was sheer agony. The wind whipped at their faces like shattered glass, tearing at the exposed skin above their beards. It took them nearly half an hour to ascend the driveway, a grueling march that tested the absolute limits of their physical endurance. By the time they reached the heavy oak door of the cabin, Jackson Cole and Leon Rossi were stumbling, their eyes rolling back as their core temperatures plummeted. Grizzly Jenkins, his beard frozen solid into a block of ice, raised a massive, trembling fist and slammed it against the wood. Inside the cabin, Beatrice was just about to settle into her reading chair when the dull, heavy thud echoed through the room. She froze. Her heart skipped a violent beat against her ribs. No one came up this mountain in the winter, let alone in the middle of a historic blizzard. The nearest town was 20 miles away. Thud, thud, thud. The knocking grew frantic, accompanied by the muffled, desperate shouts of deep, baritone voices. Beatrice moved cautiously towards the front door. Her instincts screamed at her to turn off the lights and pretend she wasn't home. This was the wilderness. Isolation bred a specific kind of paranoia. She reached into the tall wooden cabinet beside the entryway and pulled out her late husband's 12-gauge Winchester pump-action shotgun. It was heavy, comforting, and fully loaded. Holding the weapon firmly at her side, out of view, Beatrice leaned forward and peered through the small, frosted peephole. She gasped, stepping back involuntarily. Crowded onto her front porch were the largest, most intimidating men she had ever seen. They were clad in heavy leather jackets, though the garments were now entirely encased in white frost. On the back of the man closest to the door, she could clearly see the chilling emblem. A winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet, with the words, "Hell's Angels," curving over the top in bold, menacing letters. Beatrice's breath hitched. She watched the news. She knew the reputation that preceded these men. They were a violent motorcycle gang, an organized syndicate of outlaws. To let one into her home was a terrifying prospect. To let 9 of them in was surely a death sentence. "Please," a voice roared from the other side, muffled by the thick wood. "We have a kid out here. He's dying. Please, lady, we saw the light." Beatrice looked through the peephole again. The massive man at the front, Grizzly, was no longer pounding on the door. He was leaning his forehead against the wood, his eyes closed, his broad shoulders shaking violently. Beside him, 2 other giants were holding up a younger boy who was completely limp, his head lolling backward, skin pale as the snow surrounding them. The teacher in Beatrice, the mother who had raised 2 children of her own, waged a sudden violent war against the survivalist. "If I open this door, they might kill me," she thought, her grip tightening on the smooth wooden stock of the shotgun. "But if I don't, I will have to live with the ghosts of 9 men freezing to death on my porch." Beatrice Washington took a deep, shuddering breath. She leaned the shotgun against the wall, unlocking the deadbolt, the chain, and the heavy iron latch. She pulled the door open. The immediate force of the blizzard nearly knocked her off her feet. A blast of sub-zero wind tore into the warm cabin, bringing with it the overwhelming smell of wet leather, exhaust fumes, sweat, and desperate fear. Grizzly stumbled forward, his knees nearly giving out as the warmth of the cabin hit his frozen face. He looked down at the petite, silver-haired black woman standing before him. He expected a terrified local, perhaps a man with a gun. Instead, he met the unyielding, calm eyes of a matriarch. "Get him inside," Beatrice commanded, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind with stunning authority. She didn't flinch. She pointed toward the large braided rug in front of the roaring fireplace. "Right there, lay him down. The rest of you, shut that door before you freeze my pipes." The Hells Angels poured into the cabin like a tide of frozen leather and denim. Arthur and Tommy carefully laid young Cody onto the rug. The others collapsed around the room, gasping for air, their bodies convulsing as the warm air triggered violent shivering. Grizzly pushed the heavy door shut, leaning against it as he slid down to the floor. For a moment, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling of the fire and the ragged, desperate breathing of the outlaws. Beatrice didn't waste a single second on fear. Action was required. She stepped over the massive booted legs of Jackson and Samuel, making her way to the linen closet. "Who is your medic?" she asked loudly, throwing an armful of thick wool blankets onto the nearest armchair. Wyatt Ford raised a trembling, frost-bitten hand. "I am, ma'am. They call me Doc." "Well, Doc, your boy here is in trouble," Beatrice said, kneeling beside Cody. She unzipped his freezing, stiff leather jacket and began aggressively rubbing his chest. "We need to get this wet gear off him, and off the rest of you. I have dry clothes upstairs. They belong to my husband. They might be a tight fit, but they're better than wearing ice." Grizzly, slowly regaining his faculties, watched in stunned silence. This 70-something woman was ordering around his chapter of Hell's Angels as if they were errant schoolchildren who had stayed out too late in the rain. "Do as she says," Grizzly rasped, forcing himself to his feet. "Peel the leather off. Doc, tend to the kid." The intimidating aura of the biker gang vanished, replaced by the vulnerable reality of men fighting for their lives. Heavy, soaked leather vests, adorned with patches that commanded fear on the streets, were tossed unceremoniously into a pile by the door. Underneath, the men were bruised, battered, and shivering uncontrollably. Beatrice hurried to the kitchen, filling a massive iron kettle with water and turning the stove on high. She pulled down tins of instant broth and began dumping them into a pot. When she returned to the living room, carrying a stack of oversized flannel shirts and sweatpants, she found Grizzly standing near the fire, holding his damp cut in his hands. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a complex mixture of exhaustion and profound gratitude. "Ma'am," Grizzly said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You didn't have to open that door. We know what we look like. We know what people think of us." Beatrice stopped in front of him. She looked up at the giant of a man, her expression stern but remarkably kind. "Mr. Jenkins, Dan Jenkins. They call me Grizzly." "Well, Mr. Grizzly," Beatrice replied, handing him a folded red flannel shirt. "I don't care what colours you fly, what gang you ride for, or what sins you carry in those saddlebags. In my house, you wipe your boots, you mind your manners, and you drink your broth. Tonight, you aren't outlaws. You're just 9 men who need to get warm." The next few hours were a chaotic blur of triage and survival. Beatrice's pristine, quiet cabin was transformed into a makeshift field hospital. Doc Ford, though struggling with the numbness in his own hands, worked diligently on Cody. The young biker's core temperature was dangerously low. Beatrice knelt beside them, pressing hot, damp towels to the boy's neck, armpits and groin, the fastest way to warm the blood. "Come on, son, stay with us," Beatrice murmured, stroking Cody's damp hair. "You're too young to let a little snow take you out." Slowly, agonizingly, the colour began to return to Cody's cheeks. He coughed violently, his eyes fluttering open to see the strange, gentle face of the elderly woman looming over him. "Mom," he mumbled deliriously. "Close enough tonight, honey," Beatrice smiled softly, feeding him a spoonful of hot chicken broth. "Just swallow this." Across the room, the rest of the Hell's Angels were beginning to thaw. The scene was surreal. These heavily tattooed, scarred men, some of whom had spent years in federal penitentiaries, were huddled under floral quilts and knitted afghans, wearing Robert Washington's old plaid pajamas and oversized sweatpants. Tommy Gallagher, a man whose rap sheet was as long as his arm, was sitting cross-legged by the hearth, awkwardly holding a delicate porcelain teacup filled with steaming chamomile tea. Leon Rossi, a tough-as-nails enforcer, was quietly helping Jackson Cole wrap his blistered, frost-bitten fingers in gauze. Beatrice moved among them tirelessly. She hauled out a massive cast-iron Dutch oven and began preparing a massive batch of her famous beef and barley stew, throwing in every root vegetable and cut of meat she had in the freezer. The rich, savoury aroma quickly filled the cabin, replacing the harsh metallic scent of the cold. Grizzly sat at the small wooden dining table, watching her every move. The storm outside was intensifying, the wind violently rattling the window panes. But inside, there was a profound, unexpected peace. "You live up here all alone, Mrs. Washington?" Grizzly asked, as she set a steaming bowl of stew in front of him. "I do," Beatrice replied, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite the imposing biker. She wiped her hands on her apron. "My Robert passed 10 years ago this spring. Kids are grown and moved to the East Coast. It's just me and the mountain now." Grizzly took a slow, heavy bite of the stew. He closed his eyes, savouring the warmth. "This is incredible. Thank you." He paused, looking down at his scarred knuckles. "Most people would have let us freeze. They would have looked through that peephole, seen the death's head, and decided the world was better off with a few less of us in it." Beatrice looked at him thoughtfully. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Jenkins. I picked up my husband's shotgun before I opened that door." Grizzly let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "Smart woman. So why did you open it?" Beatrice's gaze drifted toward the fire, where young Cody was now sitting up, laughing weakly at a joke Caleb had made. The firelight danced across her weathered face, highlighting lines of deep, unspoken grief. "Because," Beatrice started, her voice softening, 35 years ago, my older brother, Thomas, was caught in a bad situation in Oakland. He was stranded, surrounded by people who wanted to do him serious harm. A man on a motorcycle, a man wearing your patch, stopped. He didn't know my brother, but he pulled him onto the back of his bike and got him out of there. Saved his life." Grizzly stopped eating. The rest of the men in the room, previously chatting in low voices, suddenly went dead silent. The crackling of the fire was the only sound left. Beatrice continued, her eyes locked on Grizzly's. "That biker got stabbed in the shoulder during the scuffle. My brother asked him why he risked his life for a stranger. The biker told him, 'The road doesn't care who you are. Out here, you either help the man in the ditch or you become him.'" Grizzly's breath caught in his throat. He slowly set his spoon down. His massive, calloused hand reached up to his left shoulder, unconsciously rubbing a thick, jagged scar hidden beneath his flannel shirt. He stared at Beatrice, his dark eyes wide with sudden, staggering realization. "Your brother." Grizzly's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with an emotion none of his men had ever seen him display. "Your brother's name was Tommy Hayes. He was wearing a bright yellow mechanic's jacket." Beatrice's heart stopped. She stared at the giant man across the table, the air in the cabin suddenly feeling entirely devoid of oxygen. "Yes," she breathed out, a tremor entering her hands. "How could you possibly know that?" Grizzly slowly pushed his chair back. He unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his borrowed flannel shirt and pulled the collar aside, revealing the thick, raised keloid scar on his left clavicle. "Because," Grizzly said, his voice breaking under the weight of a 35-year-old memory, "I was the man on the motorcycle." The silence in the cabin was so absolute that the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner sounded like hammer strikes. The 8 other Hell's Angels, men who had stared down loaded gun barrels and walked through maximum security prison yards without blinking, were entirely immobilized. They stared at their chapter president, the undisputed, iron-fisted ruler of their brotherhood, who was currently sitting with his shirt pulled aside, exposing a gruesome wound for an elderly widow. Beatrice slowly reached across the table. Her hand, dark and deeply lined with age, trembled as her fingertips hovered mere inches from the jagged keloid tissue on Grizzly's collarbone. She didn't touch it, but the proximity alone carried the weight of a sacred acknowledgement. "Oakland," Beatrice whispered, the tears she had fought so hard to suppress finally breaking free, tracing glistening paths down her weathered cheeks. "October 1989, 2 weeks before the earthquake." Grizzly slowly nodded, carefully rebuttoning his flannel shirt. His massive chest heaved with a heavy sigh. "Down by the old shipyards. It was pouring rain. I was 25 years old, just got my full patch. I was riding back from a run to the bay when I saw them. 5 guys backing a young black kid against a chain-link fence. They had chains and a switchblade." Grizzly's dark eyes locked onto Beatrice's, the memory playing out vividly in the space between them. "I didn't think about it. I just dropped the clutch and jumped the curb. Put the bike right between him and them. He told me you swung a heavy motorcycle chain," Beatrice said, a wet, breathless laugh escaping her lips. "He said you fought like a demon straight out of hell, and when one of them managed to get a blade into your shoulder, you didn't even drop. You just grabbed my brother by the collar, threw him on the back of your panhead, and tore out of there before the cops arrived. We laid low under an overpass until the bleeding stopped," Grizzly recalled, a faint, nostalgic smile touching his lips. "He was a good kid. Kept trying to give me his jacket to press against the wound. Kept asking me why a white biker in a Hell's Angels cut would take a knife for a kid he didn't know." "And you told him," Beatrice softly finished, "the road doesn't care who you are. You either help the man in the ditch, or you become him. I was a rough kid back then, Mrs. Washington, angry at the world. But looking at your brother, he looked terrified, but he didn't look broken. I saw a life that hadn't been ruined yet. I couldn't let them ruin it." Grizzly leaned forward, resting his massive elbows on the table. "What happened to him? To Tommy?" Beatrice reached into the pocket of her thick wool cardigan and pulled out a worn, embroidered handkerchief, dabbing carefully at her eyes. "That night changed him, Mr. Jenkins. He was running with a bad crowd, teetering on the edge of a very dark cliff. After you saved him, he realized how fragile it all was. He went back to school, became a structural engineer. He helped rebuild the city after the Loma Prieta quake." She stood up, her joints popping slightly in the cold, and walked over to a heavy oak bookshelf. She returned with a silver-framed photograph and slid it across the table. It was a picture of a handsome, grey-haired black man surrounded by a laughing family, a wife, 3 grown children, and 2 toddlers. He had a beautiful life. He passed away from pancreatic cancer 5 years ago. But he lived, Mr. Jenkins. He lived to be 65 years old, he had grandchildren, and he left a legacy of kindness. None of that, absolutely none of it, would have existed if you hadn't stopped your motorcycle in the rain 35 years ago. Grizzly stared down at the photograph. The intimidating, mountain-sized outlaw swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. A single rogue tear escaped his eye and disappeared into his thick, steel-grey beard. For a man whose life was built on violence, intimidation, and survival, the sudden collision with the profound, positive ripple effect of one single act of mercy was overwhelming. Around the room, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Arthur Bull Maddox, a man with a spiderweb tattoo covering his throat, was aggressively wiping his nose on the sleeve of his borrowed sweatshirt. Tommy Wrench Gallagher was staring into his teacup as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Well, I'll be damned," Wyatt Doc Ford muttered from the hearth, gently checking Cody's pulse once more. "The universe really does keep a ledger." Beatrice took a deep, steadying breath, reasserting her role as the matriarch of the cabin. "It seems we are completely even, Mr. Jenkins. You saved my blood. I save yours." She turned her sharp gaze to the rest of the room. "Now, the storm is getting worse, and this stew isn't going to eat itself. Grab your bowls, and somebody put another log on that fire before my bones freeze." The men moved with a newfound, almost reverent obedience. The imposing Hell's Angels lined up in Beatrice Washington's small country kitchen like schoolboys in a cafeteria line. They carefully ladled the rich, steaming beef and barley stew into ceramic bowls, being painstakingly careful not to spill a single drop on her pristine countertops. As they ate, the howling of the blizzard outside seemed to fade into the background. The cabin was filled with the clinking of spoons against porcelain and the low murmurs of tired men finding sanctuary. They shared stories, not of club business or highway runs, but of simpler things. Wrench talked about his daughter's upcoming middle school graduation. Ghost, a frighteningly quiet man with a scarred face, confessed a surprising passion for cultivating heirloom tomatoes. Beatrice moved among them, pouring more hot tea, offering extra slices of buttered sourdough bread, and watching the harsh, jagged edges of these outlaws soften in the warmth of her home. But as the clock struck midnight, the true test of their survival was only just beginning. By 1 a.m., the temperature outside had plummeted to a historic -35 degrees. The wind had intensified from a howl to a demonic shriek, shaking the very foundations of the sturdy log cabin. The window panes were entirely opaque, coated in 3 inches of solid, blinding white rime ice. Most of the men had finally succumbed to their exhaustion. Bull, Snake, and Rip were sprawled out on the large sectional sofa, snoring in a deep, rumbling chorus. Ghost and Wrench had built a makeshift bed out of couch cushions and moving blankets on the floor. Young Cody was sleeping peacefully on the braided rug nearest the fire, his breathing finally deep and regular, the terrifying blue hue entirely gone from his lips. Only Beatrice and Grizzly remained awake. Beatrice sat in her worn leather armchair, slowly knitting a burgundy scarf under the glow of a Tiffany-style reading lamp. Grizzly sat on a heavy wooden stool near the hearth, a rusted iron poker in his hand, systematically feeding massive oak logs into the roaring fire to keep the heat pushing back against the encroaching frost. Suddenly, with a sharp, popping sound, the reading lamp died. The refrigerator in the kitchen sputtered to a halt. The hum of the baseboard heaters vanished. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the flickering, fiery orange glow of the fireplace. "Power's gone," Grizzly said, his voice a low rumble in the shadows. He didn't panic. He simply stood up, his massive frame casting a monstrous, dancing shadow against the vaulted ceiling. The main lines must have snapped under the ice, Beatrice said calmly, setting her knitting needles down in her lap. I have a backup generator in the shed out back, but it's likely frozen solid by now. We can't risk sending anyone out there to check. The cold will kill a man in 5 minutes. We stay put, Grizzly agreed, returning to his stool. As long as the wood holds out, we'll survive. He looked over his shoulder at his sleeping men, his eyes lingering on the youngest member of the pack. You're deeply worried about that boy, Beatrice observed quietly. Grizzly leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, the iron poker dangling between his knees. The darkness seemed to strip away the remaining layers of his tough exterior, leaving behind a profoundly tired man. Cody's father was my vice president, Grizzly confessed, the words heavy with guilt. A man named Iron Mike Mitchell. We rode together for 20 years. 5 years ago, Mike was killed in a drive-by. Rival club out of Nevada, the Iron Syndicate. Beatrice listened intently, the rhythmic clicking of the cooling baseboards, the only sound competing with the storm. Before Mike died in my arms on the asphalt, I made him a promise, Grizzly continued, his voice tightening. I promised I'd keep his boy out of the life. I swore I wouldn't let Cody put on the patch. Grizzly let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. I failed. Kid was drawn to the club like a moth to a flame. He grew up around us. We were his uncles, his family. The day he turned 21, he demanded to prospect. You couldn't stop him, Beatrice asked. In our world, Mrs. Washington, once a man is of age, he makes his own choices. If I pushed him away, he would have ended up running with a worse crowd just to spite me. So I kept him close. I patched him in. Grizzly looked down at his scarred, tattooed hands. But the Iron Syndicate never forgot about the Mitchell bloodline. They put a hit out on the kid last week. Beatrice's breath hitched. A hit? You mean murder? A bounty, Grizzly clarified grimly. 50 grand to whoever brings them the kid's Hell's Angels cut with his blood on it. That's why we were out in this storm. We weren't just riding, we were running. We were trying to get Cody across the state line to a safe house in New Mexico until I could negotiate a sit-down and kill the bounty. He gestured vaguely toward the frosted, impassable windows. I pushed my men too hard. I ignored the weather warnings because I was terrified of what was behind us. I almost froze 9 men to death, including the boy I swore to protect, because of my own hubris. Beatrice sat in the semi-darkness, processing the sheer gravity of what he had brought to her door. In a normal world, she would be terrified. She was harboring a target for a rival gang. But looking at Grizzly, she didn't see a ruthless warlord. She saw a father figure crumbling under the weight of an impossible promise. Guilt is a heavy saddlebag to carry, Dan, Beatrice said softly, using his given name for the first time. I know a thing or two about running from the past. Grizzly looked up, surprised by the shift in her tone. You? Running? Beatrice looked towards the mantelpiece, where the faint firelight illuminated a collection of framed photos. My Robert wasn't just a quiet man who liked the mountains. When we lived in Chicago in the 70s, he was an investigative journalist. He exposed a massive corruption ring tying the local mob to the police commissioner. She paused, her fingers mindlessly tracing the pattern of her knitted blanket. They blew up our car, Dan. I was supposed to be in it. Robert barely survived. We packed our bags the next night, changed our names, and disappeared into these mountains. We traded our entire lives, our friends, our careers, for the safety of isolation. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Grizzly's with intense, matriarchal ferocity. I spent 30 years hiding in the snow because I thought safety was the most important thing in the world. But surviving isn't the same as living. You can't protect that boy from the world forever by running from storms. Eventually, you have to turn around and face the wind. Before Grizzly could respond to the profound weight of her words, a new sound cut through the howl of the blizzard. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was the heavy, distinct crunch of thick, lugged tires grinding over the ice directly outside the front of the cabin. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. Suddenly, a massive, blinding pair of halogen headlights cut through the frosted front window, illuminating the living room in a terrifying, harsh blue glare. Grizzly was on his feet in a fraction of a second, the heavy iron fireplace poker gripped tightly in his right hand. The exhausted Hell's Angels on the floor and couches jolted awake, instinctively reaching to their belts for weapons that were no longer there, having surrendered them to the pile of wet leather by the door. "Doc, wrench! Get the kid away from the windows!" Grizzly barked, his voice dropping an octave into a lethal, commanding growl. Beatrice stood up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't hesitate. She walked swiftly to the entryway cabinet, reached behind the coats, and pulled out her husband's 12-gauge Winchester. She racked the slide with a deafening chack-chack that echoed through the tense, frozen air of the cabin. "Who is it?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. Grizzly crept toward the front window, pressing his back against the log wall, and peered through a tiny, melted gap in the frost. He could see the silhouettes of 3 massive, custom-built snowcats idling in her driveway. Men were stepping out of the enclosed cabins, carrying high-powered flashlights and long, dark shapes that were unmistakably rifles. Grizzly turned back to Beatrice, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. "It's the Iron Syndicate," Grizzly whispered. "They tracked us." The mechanical growl of the custom snowcats idled menacingly in the front yard, their massive steel treads having crushed through 5 feet of pristine snow with terrifying ease. The harsh, blinding blue halogen lights sliced through the cabin's frosted windows, casting long, distorted shadows of the 9 Hell's Angels across the log walls. Inside, the temperature was already beginning to drop without the baseboard heaters, but a sudden icy sweat broke out across Grizzly's forehead. "Everyone, stay low and out of the sight lines," Grizzly commanded, his voice a harsh whisper that cut through the panic. "Doc, get Cody into the hallway behind the stone chimney. It's the thickest part of the house. Bull, Wrench, flank the front door. Ghost, watch the back." The men, stripped of their colors and their firearms, moved with the synchronized precision of a military unit. They had survived turf wars and prison riots, but facing a heavily armed rival syndicate in their pajamas, trapped in a freezing wooden box at the top of a mountain, was a nightmare scenario. They grabbed whatever they could find. Bull hoisted a heavy cast-iron fireplace shovel. Wrench gripped a solid oak dining chair by its legs, ready to swing it like a bat. Beatrice Washington did not hide behind the chimney. She stood dead center in her living room, her posture entirely rigid, the heavy 12-gauge Winchester shotgun resting comfortably against her shoulder. The firelight flickered across her stern, deeply lined face. "Mrs. Washington," Grizzly said, stepping toward her, his hand extended. "Give me the gun. You need to get in the back with the kid. These men are killers. They won't hesitate to put a bullet through an old woman." Beatrice slowly turned her head to look at the towering biker. Her eyes were devoid of fear. They were entirely possessed by a cold, ancestral fury. "Dan Jenkins," she said smoothly. "This is my home. My husband built these walls with his bare hands. I did not survive the Chicago mob, 50 years of racial prejudice, and 10 years of mountain isolation to hand over my living room to a bunch of thugs in the snow." She pumped the shotgun again, a purely habitual gesture to check the chamber, ejecting a red shell into the air and catching it before it hit the floor. "I have 5 rounds of double-aught buckshot in this tube. You keep your men alive. I will protect my house. Outside, the heavy metal door of the lead snowcat clanked open. The wind immediately swallowed the sound, but through the momentary lull in the gale, the heavy crunch of boots on ice could be heard. "Jenkins!" a voice bellowed through an electronic bullhorn, the sound distorted but unmistakably mocking. "I know you're in there. Your tracker lit up like a Christmas tree before the grid went down." Grizzly's jaw clenched. He recognized the voice instantly. It belonged to Clayton Walsh, a ruthless enforcer for the Iron Syndicate out of Las Vegas. Clayton was a man who enjoyed the cruelty of his work, a sociopath who wore his club patch like a license to hunt. "We don't care about you, Grizzly," Clayton's voice echoed over the roaring wind. "We don't care about your frozen boys. We just want the Mitchell kid. Send the boy out to the snowcats, and the rest of you get to sit by the fire and live. You have 2 minutes to open the door, or we start shooting through the wood." In the hallway behind the stone chimney, young Cody Mitchell let out a ragged, terrified sob. He was still weak, his body trembling from the lingering effects of severe hypothermia. Doc had his hand clamped firmly over the boy's mouth to keep him quiet. "Grizz," Cody choked out, pushing Doc's hand away. "Grizz, let me go out there. If I don't go, they're going to kill all of you. They're going to kill her." He looked at Beatrice with wide, tear-filled eyes. Grizzly abandoned his spot by the window and crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He knelt in front of the young biker, grabbing Cody by the shoulders of his borrowed flannel shirt. "You listen to me," Grizzly growled, his dark eyes burning with fierce intensity. "I held your father while he bled out on the asphalt. I promised him I would keep you breathing. You are Hell's Angel's blood. We do not surrender our own. We fight or we die together. You understand me?" Before Cody could answer, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass erupted from the kitchen. "Back door!" Ghost yelled. 2 Syndicate soldiers had bypassed the front porch, tramping through the deep drifts to the rear of the cabin. One had smashed the glass pane of the kitchen door with the butt of an AR-15 assault rifle, reaching a gloved hand through the jagged shards to unlock the deadbolt. Ghost, moving with terrifying speed for a man wearing oversized sweatpants, didn't wait for the door to open. He grabbed the heavy, boiling cast-iron kettle of water that Beatrice had left on the cooling stovetop. As the heavy wooden door swung inward, bringing with it a blinding swirl of snow and 2 armed men, Ghost hurled the boiling water directly into the face of the first attacker. The man dropped his rifle, his screams instantly swallowed by the howling wind as the scalding water seared through his ski mask. The second attacker stepped over his thrashing comrade, raising his rifle toward Ghost. Boom! The deafening roar of the 12-gauge shotgun rocked the cabin. Beatrice had pivoted on her heel, firing a warning shot directly over the kitchen island. The blast of buckshot pulverized the heavy wooden doorframe inches from the second attacker's head, raining deadly splinters of oak down upon him. "The next one goes in your chest," Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing with the authority of a battlefield commander. "Get out of my house!" The attacker, stunned by the sheer concussive force of the shotgun blast in an enclosed space, and terrified by the sight of the heavily armed elderly woman, scrambled backward, dragging his screaming partner out into the blizzard. Ghost slammed the splintered door shut, dragging a heavy oak butcher's block across the floor to barricade it. He looked over his shoulder at Beatrice, his scarred face pale. "Nice shot, ma'am." "Don't flatter me, Mr. Ghost," Beatrice said, her breathing heavy but controlled, her hands steady as a rock. "I missed on purpose. Next time, I won't." The temporary victory at the back door only served to enrage the men outside. Clayton Walsh, realizing that the Hell's Angels were not only awake, but willing to fight, changed his tactics. If they couldn't simply walk in and take the boy, They would let the mountain do the dirty work. "Take out the windows!" Clayton's voice roared over the bullhorn. A hail of gunfire erupted from the snowcats. The sound was deafening, a relentless staccato of automatic weapons tearing through the peaceful silence of the wilderness. Glass exploded inward like shrapnel. The heavy antique Tiffany lamp shattered into 1,000 colourful pieces. The framed photographs on the mantelpiece, including the picture of Beatrice's brother, were blown to pieces. "Get down! Keep your heads down!" Grizzly roared, throwing his massive body over Beatrice, pinning her to the braided rug as bullets chewed through the log walls and shredded the upholstery of the armchairs. For an agonizing 60 seconds, the cabin was a war zone. Then the shooting abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the gunfire. With the front windows completely blown out, the blizzard roared directly into the living room. The -35-degree wind whipped through the cabin, instantly extinguishing the fire in the hearth. The temperature inside plummeted from a comfortable 60 degrees to below freezing in a matter of seconds. "They're freezing us out," Doc yelled over the wind, shielding Cody's fragile body with his own. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the cold drops us all again." Grizzly pushed himself off Beatrice, his eyes scanning the devastation of her beautiful home. The plush furniture was ruined, the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, and snow was aggressively drifting onto the hardwood floors. He looked at the shotgun in Beatrice's hands. They had 4 shells left. Outside, there were at least 6 heavily armed men sitting in heated snowcats. "We can't stay on the defensive," Grizzly said, his voice grim. He looked at his men. They were shivering violently again, their muscles locking up as the adrenaline wore off and the brutal cold seeped into their bones. "If we stay in here, we freeze to death or they pick us off. We have to take the cats." "Take the snowcats?" Wrench repeated, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Grizz, they have ARs. We have a fireplace poker and a frying pan. They think we're trapped like rats," Grizzly reasoned, his tactical mind racing. "They're sitting in those heated cabs, waiting for us to die. They aren't expecting us to charge." He looked at Beatrice. "Mrs. Washington, how many exits does this place have?" Beatrice, brushing glass shards off her wool cardigan, pointed toward the hallway. "There's a storm cellar door beneath the floorboards in the pantry. It leads out to the side of the house, right by the woodpile. The snow will be deep, but it will put you in their blind spot behind the tree line." Grizzly nodded. "Bull, wrench, snake, rip. You're with me. We flank them through the cellar. We take out the drivers, hijack the cabs, and turn their own guns on them. Ghost Caleb, you stay here with Doc and the kid. Guard the front door." "I'm going with you," Beatrice suddenly announced. She broke open the shotgun, loading 2 fresh shells from her pocket into the tube. "Absolutely not," Grizzly argued, stepping in front of her. "You have done enough. You saved our lives. I am not letting you walk into a crossfire." Beatrice stared up at the giant biker, her eyes blazing. "Dan Jenkins, they just shot up my husband's living room. They broke my brother's photograph, and they brought the storm into my house. You do not know this property. You do not know where the drop-offs are under that snow." "I do. You lead the charge. I provide the covering fire." Grizzly opened his mouth to argue, but looking into her unyielding eyes, he knew it was entirely useless. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. "All right, but you stay behind my back, always behind my back." The 5 Hells Angels and the 72-year-old widow moved quietly into the pantry. Beatrice pulled up a heavy trapdoor, revealing a set of dark wooden stairs leading into the earthen cellar. The air down here was stagnant and freezing, smelling of damp root vegetables and old dust. They waded through the darkness, reaching a heavy slanted storm door at the far end. "Push on 3, Grizzly whispered to Bull. The two massive men placed their shoulders against the freezing wood. 1, 2, 3. With a grunt of sheer exertion, they shoved the doors upward, breaking through 4 feet of compacted snow. The wind immediately hit them like a physical blow, stealing the breath from their lungs. They crawled out into the blizzard, the visibility so poor they could barely see their own hands. But they could see the glowing blue halos of the snowcat's headlights about 50 yards away, idling at the front of the cabin. "Stay low in the trench we just dug," Beatrice whispered, pointing toward a massive row of stacked oak logs that bordered the driveway. "Follow the woodpile. It will lead you right to the passenger side of the rear cat." Moving like phantoms through the whiteout, the men crept along the woodpile. The freezing wind masked the sound of their approach. When they reached the end of the logs, they were mere feet from the rear snowcat. Through the frosted glass of the cab, Grizzly could see 2 syndicate soldiers sitting in the heated interior, laughing as they smoked cigarettes, their rifles resting carelessly on the dashboard. Grizzly held up a hand, signaling his men. He looked back at Beatrice, who was crouched behind him, the shotgun resting on a snowy log, aimed perfectly at the cab of the second snowcat. Grizzly gripped the heavy iron fireplace poker. He didn't wait for a signal. He exploded from the snowdrift with the terrifying primal roar of a wounded bear. He leaped onto the heavy treads of the snowcat, bringing the heavy iron poker down with earth-shattering force against the passenger side window. The reinforced glass shattered. Before the syndicate soldier inside could even process the breach, Grizzly's massive hand shot through the opening, grabbing the man by the tactical vest and hauling him halfway out the window, slamming his head against the steel frame. Chaos erupted. Bull and Wrench swarmed the driver's side, ripping the door open and dragging the screaming driver out into the freezing snow. The massive Hell's Angels, fueled by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, descended upon the armed men with bare fists and heavy boots, a brutal close-quarters brawl in the blinding snow. In the lead snowcat, Clayton Walsh heard the commotion over the wind. He scrambled for his radio. "Rear cab, talk to me." Getting no answer, he grabbed his rifle and kicked open his door, stepping out onto the treads to get a line of sight. He saw Grizzly Jenkins standing victorious over the rear snowcat, holding a captured AR-15. Clayton raised his weapon, aiming the red dot sight squarely at Grizzly's chest. "Die, you obsolete piece of—" Boom! A blast of buckshot tore through the blizzard, obliterating the side mirror of Clayton's snowcat, inches from his face. The sheer force and surprise sent the syndicate leader tumbling backward into the deep snow. Beatrice Washington pumped the Winchester again, stepping out from behind the woodpile, a terrifying silhouette against the storm. "I told you," her voice rang out, clear and steady. "Get out of my yard!" The deafening blast of Beatrice Washington's 12-gauge shotgun echoed off the granite peaks, momentarily drowning out the relentless howl of the blizzard. Clayton Walsh, the notoriously sadistic enforcer of the Iron Syndicate, scrambled backward through the waist-deep snow. He clutched his face where a piece of the pulverized side mirror had sliced a deep, jagged gash across his cheek, the crimson blood instantly freezing in the sub-zero air. "Covering fire!" Grizzly roared over the wind. Without waiting for Clayton to recover his footing or his dropped assault rifle, Grizzly launched himself off the heavy steel treads of the captured snowcat. Moving with the terrifying, unhinged ferocity of an apex predator defending its pack, the Hells Angels president hit Clayton square in the chest, driving the smaller man deep into a heavy snowdrift. Around them, the driveway devolved into a scene of absolute, chaotic brutality. Arthur Bull Maddox and Tommy Wrench Gallagher were systematically dismantling the remaining syndicate soldiers. The Iron Syndicate men had the advantage of high-powered weaponry and thermal winter gear. but they had fundamentally miscalculated the sheer, desperate willpower of cornered men. Wrench, wielding nothing but his heavy, steel-toed boots and a massive metal wrench scavenged from the snowcat cab, brought a syndicate driver to his knees with a crushing blow to the ribs. Bull absorbed a glancing blow from a rifle stock to his shoulder, only to grab his attacker by the throat and hurl him violently against the unyielding oak woodpile. Beatrice stood her ground by the edge of the trench. The wind whipped her silver hair wildly, her heavy wool cardigan offering almost no protection against the -35-degree chill. Her hands were going numb, the heavy wooden stock of the Winchester feeling like a block of solid ice. But her aim never wavered. She tracked the chaos with the cold, calculating precision of a veteran. A third syndicate soldier, a young man with panicked eyes, managed to draw a semi-automatic pistol from his tactical holster, aiming it directly at Wrench's exposed back. Beatrice didn't blink. She racked the slide, ejecting the spent shell casing, and fired. The blast of buckshot didn't hit the man. She intentionally aimed low, but it tore through the snow directly between his boots, kicking up a blinding geyser of ice and shredded oak bark. The man shrieked, dropping the pistol as he threw his hands over his face, completely neutralized by the sheer terror of the unseen sniper in the dark. Meanwhile, Grizzly and Clayton were locked in a death match. Clayton managed to draw a serrated hunting knife, slashing wildly and carving a bloody path through Grizzly's thick, steel-grey beard. Grizzly ignored the searing pain. He grabbed Clayton's wrist with his left hand, his massive fingers wrapping around the joint like an industrial vice, and squeezed until a sickening pop echoed through the storm. Clayton screamed, dropping the knife. "You're done!" Grizzly bellowed. He drove his forehead down into the bridge of Clayton's nose with a sickening crunch. Clayton's eyes rolled back, and his body went entirely limp in the snowdrift. Grizzly stood up, his chest heaving. He looked around the driveway. The 5 Iron Syndicate soldiers were either unconscious or kneeling in the snow with their hands raised in absolute surrender, terrified of the elderly woman aiming a shotgun at them from the shadows. "Wrench, Bull!" Grizzly shouted, wiping freezing blood from his jaw. "Disarm them! Rip, get to the front door. Tell Doc and the boys we have the cats." Within minutes, the tide had completely turned. The Hells Angels, bruised, bleeding, and freezing in borrowed sweatpants, stood victorious. Grizzly dragged Clayton's unconscious body toward the largest snowcat, throwing him into the back of the heated cab, and motioning for his men to do the same with the others. "We're not killing them," Grizzly told his men, pulling zip ties from Clayton's vest. "Bind them. We turned the heat down to 40 degrees, just enough to keep them from dying until dawn. Then we hand them over to Sheriff Miller. He owes the club a favor." Grizzly trudged back through the deep snow toward the woodpile. Beatrice was still standing there, but as Grizzly approached, her adrenaline finally crashed. Her knees buckled, the heavy weapon slipping from her numb fingers. Grizzly lunged forward, catching the petite widow before she hit the ice. "I've got you, Mrs. Washington," he murmured, shielding her from the wind. "The fight is over." "My house," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at her bullet-scarred, freezing cabin. "They ruined my house, Dan." The guilt hit Grizzly harder than Clayton's knife. "Wrench," he barked. "Pull the snowcats to the porch, blast their heaters into the windows." The rest of the night was a grueling exercise in damage control. The massive snowcats blasted diesel-fueled heat into the blown-out windows, while Wrench and Ghost built a makeshift barricade with tarps and shattered floorboards. Inside, Doc stitched Grizzly's jaw with a sewing kit and cheap whiskey. Beatrice sat in her kitchen wrapped in quilts, watching the hardened outlaws quietly sweep up glass and right overturned furniture. As the hours bled away, the howling wind softened into a gentle powder. Grizzly walked into the kitchen, setting a steaming mug of instant coffee in front of Beatrice. "The storm is breaking," he said softly. "The plows will make it up by noon. Then we take Clayton and get Cody across the state line. I'll hold Clayton hostage until they permanently revoke the bounty." He paused, looking at the floor. "And then, I figure out how to pay you back for this." "You don't owe me anything," Beatrice said, though her heart ached for her ruined home. "You protected me." "We brought a war to your doorstep," Grizzly countered, his voice thick with shame. "I cannot just ride away from that." Beatrice placed her age-spotted hand over his scarred knuckles. "You told my brother you either help the man in the ditch or you become him. Tonight, we were all in the ditch, Dan. We survived. That is enough." But as Grizzly looked into her weary eyes, he knew surviving was not enough. Beatrice Washington had earned their blood, and as the morning sun broke, he formed a plan that would change her life forever. The dawn brought a blinding, brilliant light to the San Juan Mountains, illuminating a landscape of terrifying, untouched beauty. Inside the shattered cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with exhaustion. The 8 Hells Angels were quietly strapping on their boots and gathering their dried leather cuts, preparing for the treacherous journey down the mountain. Beatrice stood by the kitchen counter, packing a canvas duffel bag with leftover stew and medical supplies. A profound melancholy settled over her. In less than 12 hours, these terrifying outlaws had become intrinsically woven into her life. Now they were leaving, and she would be alone once again in the ruins of her sanctuary. Grizzly walked into the kitchen, fully dressed in his heavy leather vest. The iconic Death's Head logo on his back seemed to carry a different weight now. It was a badge of survival. He reached out and took the heavy canvas bag from her hands. "The boys are ready," Grizzly rumbled softly. "We have the syndicate rats locked in the second cat. We'll be gone before the county plows clear the lower pass." Beatrice nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "You drive safe, Dan Jenkins. Keep that boy out of trouble and get that bounty off his head." Grizzly didn't move toward the door. Instead, he reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy object wrapped in a waterproof military pouch, placing it carefully on the counter. "Last night I found Clayton Walsh's satellite phone," Grizzly explained. "I made a call to our national treasurer." He unzipped the pouch, revealing a staggering stack of tightly banded $100 bills, easily over $100,000 in pure, untraceable cash. Beatrice gasped, stepping back. "Dan, no, I cannot accept stolen money." "It's not stolen, and it's not from illegal operations," Grizzly interrupted gently. "It's the bounty." Seeing her bewilderment, he continued, a dark smirk touching his mouth. "Clayton Walsh had $50,000 in a secure offshore account to pay for Cody's cut. When I broke his nose, I broke his spirit. I forced him to transfer the fund to a dummy account. My treasurer then wired clean, legal funds from our legitimate repair businesses to a courier. This cash was driven up to the lower pass an hour ago." He pushed the stack closer. "The Iron Syndicate just paid for your new windows, furniture and roof. The rest is to keep this place running." "Dan, this is too much," Beatrice whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "There's more," Grizzly said, his voice thickening. He gestured toward the living room. Standing in a semicircle in the center of the devastated room were the 8 remaining Hells Angels. They were no longer the shivering, dying men she had pulled from the storm. They stood tall, their expressions intensely serious. As Beatrice entered, the men moved with synchronized precision. Every single man, including young Cody, slowly lowered themselves to one knee, bowing their heads in a gesture of absolute respect. Beatrice covered her mouth. a choked sob escaping. In the hyper-violent world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, a Hell's Angel bows to no one. To see 8 patched members kneeling in her living room defied all logic. Grizzly walked up behind her. He didn't kneel, but he removed his heavy leather cut, the sacred vest denoting his absolute authority as president. He walked to the shattered mantelpiece and carefully laid his president's cut over the back of Beatrice's favorite rocking chair. "Mrs. Washington," Grizzly's voice echoed, thick with unshed tears. "You saved my life 35 years ago by giving your brother the grace to live. You saved my men tonight by opening your door when the world would have let us die. You bled for us." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with sincerity. "That cut stays here. It is a marker. Any man who steps foot on this mountain will know that Beatrice Washington is under the eternal, unbreakable protection of the Hell's Angels. If anyone ever raises a hand to you, they will have 300 of my brothers at their door by nightfall." The tears spilled over Beatrice's cheeks. She walked forward, ignoring the money and the ruined house, and pulled the towering Grizzly Jenkins into a fierce embrace. The giant biker froze briefly before his massive arms wrapped around her. "Thank you, Dan," she whispered. "No, ma'am," he replied softly. "Thank you." One by one, the men rose, offering tight, respectful hugs. 10 minutes later, the mechanical roar of the snowcats echoed through the valley. Beatrice stood on her shattered porch, watching them disappear into the morning sun. Her house was a disaster zone, but looking at the leather jacket draped over her rocking chair, she didn't feel fear. For the first time in 10 years, she felt entirely safe. The legend of the winter of 2026 became a whispered myth among the outlaw chapters of the American West. They spoke of a terrifying blizzard, and the iron-willed black matriarch who held the line against the Iron Syndicate with a pump-action shotgun. Beatrice Washington never left her mountain. True to Grizzly's word, by the spring thaw, a fleet of heavily tattooed contractors arrived, rebuilding her cabin stronger and completely impenetrable. The local sheriff turned a blind eye to the biker money funding the renovations. Grizzly negotiated the bounty off Cody's head, ensuring the young man lived to see his future. And every Thanksgiving, without fail, the deafening roar of V-twin engines echoed up the treacherous mountain pass, as men flying the Death's Head patch arrived not as outlaws, but as sons returning home.